So good morning and thanks for coming along today. I just want to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I'd particularly like to recognise those First Nation individuals who have contributed to the defence of Australia in times of both peace and war. So as Tali said, my name's Sally, and I'm roughly about halfway through my PhD with Kirsten, Alex, and I've picked up a third supervisor, Vince, as well. My topic of interest is high reliability followership and behaviour in elite military teams, the role of identity content, identity leadership and a shared identity content. I'll spend some time now just talking about a study that I'm still writing up. So the scope. I'm really going to quickly talk about the theoretical framework. I'm guessing that most people are on Zoom and in the room have at least a working knowledge of HRO, theorising, and also social identity. I'll then talk about a study that I'm writing up, and I really want to talk about it today because I would like your feedback and any inputs about how I'm presenting it and how I can make that better. I'll wrap up with a very quick case study at the end. So high reliability organizations. In the 1980s, there was a group of researchers at Berkeley who started conducting research on three organizations, these being an electric company, air traffic control area control center, and a US Navy aircraft carrier. The focus on these organizations wasn't random. They recognized that these three organizations were able to deliver output and do it pretty much error-free. High reliability organizations then are organizations where catastrophic events should happen, but don't. This work was subsequently built on developing the idea of the collective mind. And they did this through observations on how individuals interrelate with each other on US Navy aircraft carrier decks to enable the smooth takeoff and landing of aircraft. So the collective mind is how the team interrelate with each other. It's a complex adaptive system tied together by trust. And so this is how the HRO succeeds. It is the team interrelating and working together towards a shared goal. This construct of collective mindfulness has 5 principles or behaviors. Preoccupation with failure, which is recognizing all failures as problematic for the organization and working to eliminate all negative effects. A reluctance to simplify, so digging below the surface to engage appropriately with the breadth and depth of matters. A sensitivity to operations, and I think of this as a situational awareness, that kind of collective, big picture collectiveness, having a comprehensive understanding of what's going on in the organization. A commitment to resilience is being motivated to ensure that the organization are not disabled by any failures and they're able to move on. And a deference to expertise, so ensuring that the most qualified person is able and empowered to provide their input. So social identity is a cognitive mechanism which influences group behavior. The idea that there is a shift from our personal identity to our social identity. Traditionally in the military, we really like the idea of leaders. But social identity theorists have challenged this very individualistic emphasis. Instead, they emphasize the importance of the group and in particular followership and the mobilization of followers as indicators for effective leadership. However, what actually makes a leader effective? And remember, effective does not always mean good. Within identity leadership, there's 4 aspects have been identified that need to be integrated together for effective leadership. Leaders need to not only be representative, but be seen by the group to be representative. They need to advance group goals and be seen by the group to advance group goals. The group identity is molded, shaped and cultivated by the leader, and reality is interpreted in the image of the group identity. Importantly, these aspects need to be present and continue to be present over time for effective leadership. For example, a leader can be of the group but fail to advance the goals of the group, or can fall into the leadership trap of believing themselves above the group. So this is the social identity model of high reliability organizations. So much of the HRO theorizing to date has concentrated on what constitutes an HRO. Research has largely had a descriptive focus, or has been looking at the processes of what makes an HRO an HRO. What we've tried to do with this research is try and understand how the behavior in the military is, for the most part, highly reliable. But I want to emphasize, like effective leadership is not always good leadership, highly reliable behavior is not always moral and ethical behavior. So how does the military organization create elite teams that are able to pretty much consistently achieve tasks with near perfect accuracy? How is it that the organization can sustain this over many years, given the fact that in the military, people change their jobs every 2 to 3 years? So in particular, we're focusing on step 1. And this study aims to assess social identity in the present. Do participants define themselves as members of a group or as a collective, and do they internalize norms? And do these norms support the principles of HRO? In particular, what is the strength, the alignment, the content, and the integration of these groups into the wider organization? So now to talk about the research. So how do members of military organizations experience and engage in high reliability followership? This study involved semi-structured interviews with members of Air Combat Group, or individuals who have been part of Air Combat Group during their military career. Now, Air Combat Group, or ACG, is the group within the Royal Australian Air Force that deals with combat operations, so in particular combat aircraft. So thinking about F-35s, F-18s, Growler, EA-18Gs as well, the Growler aircraft. Aircrew were recruited via emails, and snowballing occurred naturally. The participant pool was expanded to combat controllers for generalizability, and combat controllers are a group within ACG, and they're individuals who are specially selected and trained, and they're trained to lead and direct military aircraft in support of military operations for the special forces or special operations. So 25 interviews were conducted, 2 of which were with women, and the participants were given a choice about the event that they wanted to discuss in the interview. Although we did give suggestions in the emails that we sent out of either a blue on blue in a training, or a peacetime scenario, or a difficult decision on operations. So blue on blue is a Western military term that defines how a blue, or your aircraft, will attack or accidentally attack another blue aircraft. So basically you're accidentally harming your own or allied forces. So that's a blue on blue attack. The difficult decision was purposefully not defined. And we did this, and if the participants pushed me for a definition, I would just put it back on them and say, hey, any kind of difficult decision that you feel that you've experienced whilst on ops. And the reason we did that was that we wanted the participants to discuss an event that they thought was difficult. I didn't want to define it, because then it's what I think is difficult and not what they think. So we did that with purpose. The 2 focuses, peacetime and then operations, represent 2 very different contexts. One is a stable or relatively stable environment, and then the other is volatile, uncertain, complex, and an ambiguous one. One of the issues is that with the research is that I knew 20 of the 24 participants personally, which gave a unique insider viewpoint. One of the participants was interviewed twice for 2 different events. So that's the difference in numbers. So the good thing about an insider viewpoint is that it allows for the flow of free conversation in the interviews, as the participants and me, well, we talk the same language. Like most organizations, the military has a specific language which members use to describe their reality within the military. They didn't have to explain their military specific nuances or the military context. Secondly, it gave the data a richness of insight, and I was seen by the participants as one of them, or part of their group, even if we were not personally known to each other. Participants likely had an expectations that the events they were describing to me were ones that I either had first-hand experience of or that I understood as an in-group member. Interestingly, with those interviewees that I did not know well or not at all, we spent time at the beginning and during, in some cases, building our credibility with each other. I found interviewees asking me what campaigns I've been in, what aircraft I've flown, and then I found myself, particularly with the combat controllers, name-dropping special forces guys that I've worked with. And it was only once I started coding that I realized that this kind of behavior was going on. Also, on reflection, there was a strong sense of like an embedded insider, mostly led, or actually pretty much always led by the participants. They described the two of us as a we. The two of us formed a group on our own. We were a we, and we were just chatting. The only exception to this was two laterals, and a lateral is somebody that has a previous career in another air force, like me, and then joins or is recruited to join the Australian Air Force. So these two laterals in particular were from the United States. They both talked about incidences that had happened in their time when they'd been in the US military, and their language became at times very much less embedded. And now I'll give you an example of this to try and explain what I mean. And it's quite nuanced, so I don't know if it'll work or not. But there's a leadership role in the jobs that we do that is called SEAD mission lead. Now, I've been involved in SEAD for the last 20 odd years, so I have a full understanding of it. But this one participant, when was speaking to me about it, said the acronym in full, so used the whole words, and then went on to describe what the role entails to me. And this participant has worked with me, knows my background, and knows about me. And he didn't do it in a part. They didn't do it in a patronizing way, but it is like how I would describe it to you. It was how I would simplify quite a complicated role to the uninitiated. So both the US laterals slipped from talking to Sal, their workmate, or Sally, the UQ researcher. So for this, I took a critical realism stance and conducted thematic content analysis in 3 phases. The first phase consisted of repeated and active reading of the transcripts, and we used a mixed deductive and inductive approach. So codes were researcher generated using preparatory work on social identity, identity leadership, and high reliability organization theorizing. And they were also data derived, representing interesting features of the data set. In the second phase, I used the initial code list to enable patterns and themes in the data set to emerge. And then we organized them into very loose categories. We then went through a process of merging and breaking down the categories, and this went through several iterations. The third phase was the building of connections and interactions between the categories. We worked together to refine and define each of the categories, and then I organized the data into a coherent narrative, which fitted into the broader overall story of the data. It is this part that I really want to focus on today to get your input and feedback. So from the data analysis, 2 overarching themes stood out: the role of identity leadership, and much stronger was the strength and alignment of the shared identity. And I'll cover off on each of these. So the role of identity leadership. Although participants often made passing reference to rank or hierarchical status, they went on to describe the behavioral characteristics of the leaders, indicating that these factors were more important for followership than rank. In fact, what kept on coming up again and again was the importance of informal leaders who, quote, were really influential at the bog-rat level. They were probably the mentors to us. Now, just as an aside, a bog-rat is an RAAF slang term, which is somebody who is qualified but doesn't hold any hierarchical status within the team. These informal leaders embedded the shared identity content through their influence in, quote, setting the environment, the standard, the approach, the maturity to it all. Through data analysis, we found that 3 factors in particular played a significant part in whether an individual evoked followership within their teams. And these broadly mapped onto 3 of the 4 components of identity leadership, consistently displaying the core behaviors valued by the group, pursuing group goals over personal interests or glory, and actively contributing to the creation of a highly reliable team. So being one of us was highly valued, and it was an important and a really important marker of prototypicality was your credibility as a group member. And credibility was a product of both technical skills, but also experience and recency. One really important aspect of prototypicality was the value to participants of the leader's conformity to the shared identity content. Quote, he is the shining beacon of what we would all aspire to be. Can't read the rest of it, but anyway, you guys hopefully can see it. He's exceptional at what he does, always trying to be better, I think, paraphrase. Participants also highlighted the problems that arose in the team when individuals act in non-conformist ways. Team members who acted in ways that contradicted the group's shared identity content, thereby challenging the group's identity, strength and alignment, were re-educated by the team to bring them in line with group expectations. And, quote, if that trend continued, you'd probably look at some sort of social distancing and that horrible trajectory where people realize that they are no longer part of the capability. The data provided many instances where hierarchically appointed leaders were judged as unable to cultivate the group because they misunderstood or misread the shared identity content that existed. Quote, nobody wanted to be like him because he was mad. We said he was mad, live in a tank, drink insane amounts of beer, work insane longer hours, party for the other hours of the day, and sometimes sleep when you had to. This resulted in some hierarchical positions being described as day-to-day. They didn't have much influence. Second, it wasn't enough for the leader to be exceptional at their job to evoke followership. Advancing group goals or doing it for us was also necessary. The primary way participants judged whether a leader was failing to advance the group was if the leader was perceived as putting their own success above the group's. One participant described their commanding officer as being, quote, a very, 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 very capable fighter pilot, but God, you didn't take your eyes off him because he'd leave you behind. The group negatively viewed those hierarchical leaders who were judged by the group as self-interested. Quote, nobody trusted him not to look out for himself and sort of go for glory. Participants explained how this type of behavior negatively impacted the group. Quote, the outcome for the unit was a lack of faith in the command at that point and mistrust. Another participant stated, if I can explain my frame of mind, you are an emotionally excited individual. You're no longer my boss. These hierarchically appointed leaders maintained an outward title of leader, but were rejected by the group for not displaying the shared group identity content. Quote, we didn't identify with him. I guess the only group cohesion is that we weren't with him. I suppose we were against him. Screw the boss. Lastly, participants tied effective leadership into the ability to align the group's task focus and goals via identity entrepreneurship, cultivating that sense of us. Team members not only saw identity entrepreneurship as a function of the leader, but they also saw it as a function of the group. Quote, you get shaped a little bit by the community, and that happens because the community rewards the sorts of behaviours that you want to see in people. The group's cultivation of the shared identity content is so embedded that one participant noted that, quote, whether we select people that have those values and they turn up with them, or you almost adopt them when you come in, I couldn't speak to which way it is. This idea of entrepreneurship being in part a responsibility and owned by the group was recognised by those participants in hierarchical positions as well. One of the COs, or one of the participants who had been a commanding officer, said that being part of an organization that's just humming, we were doing great, not me, but the collective was. A really key point that was succinctly made by one of the participants was that the shared group identity content was often already embedded in the team. All the positional leaders needed to do was maintain themselves as part of the team and then just gently cultivate. Quote, his job was probably quite easy that way. We joined the Air Force to fly and fight as part of that. Being a combat aircraft, so all of us wanted to do it. I don't think he had to try very hard. So moving on to the strength and the alignment of the shared social identity. Early in the coding process, it was apparent that participants feel a really strong sense of identity, and this became an overarching theme, the strength and alignment of the shared military identity. This shared identity was a theme running through all the participants' narrative, and there's some quotes from the transcripts, but what was really interesting is that when participants were asked on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you identify with the team? 91% rated themselves as an 8 or higher, and 23% rated themselves as off the scale, so above 10. That's how much they identified with their role. Interestingly, the shared identity was not limited to individuals who the participants shared work identity with. The shared identity was able to expand or compress to fit around those who the participants believe held very similar beliefs or values to them. In several instances, participants expanded the group boundary to include other military groups. For example, the combat controllers had a belief that they had values and behaviours that were similar to faster aircrew, and both the aircrew and the combat controllers they saw links between themselves and the special forces. 5 additional themes emerged from the interviews, and these were engaging with ambiguity, attending to failure, proffering of expertise, commitment to perseverance, and a sensitivity to purpose. These emergent categories are action responses by the individual to the principles of HRO. And what I mean by that is that each action response is internalized as a shared social identity by the group. And the action response defines how members of the group practically respond to each of the HRO principles, thereby achieving near perfect task completion. So here's another way of visualizing it. On the left, we have the HRO principles. Each has an action response, which represents the practices of high reliability followership. These practices form the basis of the shared social identity content of the group. High reliability followership is the internalized shared social identity content manifesting in group members as engaged followership and behavior in direct response to the practicalities of the HRO principles. It's the combination of engaged followership and an internalized set of shared behaviors which defines how the groups achieve this near perfect task completion. What we found through the process of coding is that these themes or practices were constructed of sub-themes. And these sub-themes contextualize the group's shared social identity into practical behaviors that the group members participate in to achieve the group action in response to the HRO principles. These behaviors are seen by the participants as what we do or how we behave. And I'll now just go through each one. Engaging with ambiguity is a practical response to the HRO principle, reluctance to simplify. It's made up of 3 subcategories: training for unknown unknowns, recognizing inevitable uncertainty, and reducing ambiguity. Next, you've got attending to failure, which is a practical response to the HRO principle, preoccupation with failure. And this encompasses the subcategories of responsibility to improve, motivated fact-finding, and honest self-appraisal. Quote, we were all primed. And as soon as those words came out, I guess that was a trigger where we were like, yep, okay, mission creep has occurred, recalibrate. The HRO principle, commitment to resilience, has the practical group response commitment to perseverance, which is made up of taking stock and moving on, a commitment to debriefs, and nursing collective wounds. Quote, we are pretty good at understanding that you don't need a pat on the back for all the things that are done well. Let's spend our relatively precious time concentrating on the things that could be done better next time round. Proffering of expertise is a practical response to the HRO principle, a deference to expertise, and made up of 3 subcategories: experience over hierarchy, maintaining credibility, and knowing your own limitations. Quote, we respect specialization above rank. And I think that comes back to the basics of even maintaining an aeroplane. If the corporal tells you the airplane is not serviceable to fly, you're not going to argue with them, are you? That's his speciality. And as an aside, that quote comes from a former chief of the Air Force. So the top dog in the Australian Air Force, not the current one, but a one. Just so I'm not. Sensitivity to purpose, lastly, is a practical response to the HRO principle, a sensitivity to operation. And this encompasses a clear task focus, owning the purpose, and committed to excellence. Quote, taking that professionalism very seriously with an overarching understanding of the missions we do are important, and we are not going to get distracted from what our mission is. And then that's the model. So I got asked to put together a case study for a non-academic audience, which included some military types. I thought I would share what I have with you to see if you can help me make it any better or give me any kind of ideas about what I could do to it. Now, not wanting, I know we can all probably think of lovely real life case studies that we could do, but I don't want to anger them because they still pay my wages. Oh, sorry. So I chose something else. Okay, it's really predictable. I'm sorry, and it's a little bit silly, but here you go. So you have this team, and interestingly, there is some research that suggests the relationship between a front seater and a back seater in an aircraft represents a micro HRO, but that's a digression. So you have this team. And they are a team, and they're on the Top Gun course. Neither can pass on their own. They need to work together to get through. And of course, they also have to work as a group to get through. To pass this course is a group activity. They have a shared identity of work hard, play hard, complete the mission, and a mutual love of volleyball. Thing is, clue is in the call sign, Maverick. Maverick isn't following the rules of the group. Iceman tells him that Maverick, it's not your flying, it's your attitude. The enemy's dangerous, but right now you're worse. Dangerous and foolish. You may not like who's flying with you, but whose side are you on? And then Goose dies. Although not quite the same, there is a quote. This is one of the quotes from one of the participants of the study. Fratricide, shooting your lead or shooting your wingman or shooting your friendly is, if you like, probably one of the worst things you can do. That's worse than getting shot by a bad guy. Having your lead or wingman blow up because a bad guy shot you is very bad, but shooting your lead and wingman and therefore killing your lead or wingman is probably 10 times worse. And Maverick, through his actions, has killed his teammate. The group still accepts Maverick. He is, after all, the ultimate fighter pilot, but he is no longer completely one of them. Interestingly, notice it is Iceman who leads the group's acceptance of Maverick. So this is confirmed in Top Gun 2. Maverick is living alone in a garage with an airplane. Yeah. He only lasted a month as a Top Gun instructor, and he hasn't been on a squadron for years. He is a test pilot, the only pilot on the project he is working on, and his egotistical actions have meant that the project has been cancelled, thereby destroying the team. This is reinforced when he enters the Top Gun bar, and none of the best pilots and aircrew in the Navy know who he is. Hangman calls him an old man, even though Maverick clearly has his name on his jacket. There is no recognition of who or what he is. He is not one of them. He ends up getting thrown out of the bar for not following the group norms. This is reiterated when his exploits have to be read out to the team the next day when he is introduced to them. This is in contrast to Iceman. He has spent his career honing his identity leadership. He represents, he advances, he cultivates and embeds a shared identity content. in the team. He has done this to such a great effect that he has built up enough credit with the team that they accept Maverick back, even though they don't want to. They trust Iceman that much. Maverick starts acting like a bit of a tool in the air-to-air phase. And if you want me to go through some reasons for that, we can talk about that maybe at lunch. He only starts to get accepted by the team when he shows them what he can do, but not in a flashy, I'm going to kick your ass type of way. He flies the route of the mission within the time. He creates the team understanding that what they are being asked to do is achievable. He embeds the team mentality with the football playing on the beach. They are no longer a disparate group. They are now working together. However, in typical Maverick style, he almost ruins it until he gets a talk from Penny. Those are your pilots. If anything happens to them, you will never forgive yourself. And Maverick redeems himself to the group. Task completed successfully, 4 enemy aircraft destroyed, a stolen Tomcat, and back to the carrier for tea and medals. Cool. So that concludes my talk. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'd really like to hear any of the feedback and suggestions, and obviously happy for questions.